Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Despite enduring years of pernicious misinformation and an onslaught of regulations leading to product restrictions and bans, the U.S. vaping industry continues its remarkable growth. As we'll discuss shortly, in 2024, the U.S. vaping industry is projected to exceed $12 billion in sales, not including the black market, making it a goliath in both size and scope. However, halting this growth is precisely what tobacco control aims to achieve, and if that means finding common ground with big tobacco, then the ends may justify the means. Joining us today to discuss the size and scope of the U.S. vape marketplace and the pressures against it is Barnaby Page, the editorial director at Tamarind Intelligence, a market research firm specialized in providing detailed global market and regulatory analysis in the vaping, cannabis, and tobacco sectors via 3 brands: E-CigIntelligence, CannIntelligence, and TobaccoIntelligence. Barnaby, thanks for coming back on the show.
Well, thanks for having me again, Brent. It's great to be doing a second show so soon after our first one.
Yeah, that's right. You recently joined us for a RegWatch on GFN.TV episode to talk about the worldwide vape industry and how countries are stacking up. Today, let's dive into the U.S. market. But first, please take a moment to fill our viewers in a bit on who you are and what Tamarind Intelligence does.
Yeah, well, Tamarind Intelligence has been around for 10 years. We're founded in 2014. We're in fact literally just celebrating our 10th birthday at the moment, with a series of articles on our websites looking back at these industries over the last 10 years. And so those are free for anybody who wants to read. Anyway, we started out covering the e-cigarette industry in 2014 when it was a much smaller industry in every possible respect, and much less high profile, of course, but already becoming a fairly controversial one, and already becoming the subject of some fairly big regulatory measures, the Tobacco Products Directive in Europe, and of course the deeming regulations in the United States. And our focus all along really has been primarily on 2 things: on regulation and on the market, and particularly on the way that they intersect, the way that regulation affects the market. And I think in terms of today's conversation, that's clearly something that's going to come up a great deal again and again. My personal background is as a journalist. I'll be very honest and say I knew hardly anything about e-cigarettes in 2014. I barely knew what one was. But I found it an absolutely consistently fascinating industry to cover over the last decade. And I hope some of that fascination will be shared by some of your listeners.
Well, let's just shoot this right off the bat. I mean, what is your impression of regulations on e-cigarettes in the U.S.?
Well, yeah, that's a big question. I think the important thing to remember about the US, above all, is that there is a serious disconnect between the theory and the reality. The theory on paper does not look terrible. The theory is that the FDA receives applications for marketing authorizations for new e-cigarette products. It checks they're not going to be terrible for public health. It says, okay, fine, and then people can sell them. Great. That's not an irrational approach. The reality is that the FDA system, in various respects, is completely unable to cope with e-cigarettes, and certainly with applications for e-cigarettes in the volume that it's received them, the millions and millions of applications. So you end up with a market where, in practice, most products are illicit. The vast majority of products being sold in the United States are not technically legal. Now, so I say you have this disconnect between the theory and the reality. The big question is whether the FDA or perhaps other agencies will force the reality to conform to the theory. And that's a rather abstract way of saying, are they going to increase enforcement activity? Now, there's some signs that's happening, certainly. There's also many signs that enforcement is getting tighter at state and local level, which is another important level of regulation. But equally, there is a degree of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. The essential problem isn't solved. And of course, there's also uncertainty about what's happening to government and government policy in general after the election at the end of this year. I think one final thing I'll add before we carry on is just to say that, another disconnect is that between, a rather romantic image of the vaping sector, a rather idealized image of sort of, artisanal e-liquid sold by mom and pop vape stores, to enthusiastic open systems users. That's not really the US industry at all. Maybe it was to a very limited extent 8-10 years ago. It's certainly not now. The reality is disposables, big Chinese manufacturers, et cetera, et cetera. So again, people can sometimes have this other kind of view of what vaping is all about, which doesn't really reflect where the actual numbers and the reality lie. Let's take the example of flavors, because that's one of the most controversial issues in vaping regulation. And it's controversial because it's related to, or perceived to be related, to the other big issue, which is the issue of underage use, of use by minors, because there's this perception that it is flavors that attract young people to vaping. Whether or not that's true is, it's another story. In any case, the FDA is pretty clear is operating a de facto ban on flavors. There's no actual piece of legislation that says flavors are banned, but it's not authorizing any flavored products. However, that does not mean that flavored products are not being sold at all. So, in fact, they're being sold very, very widely. Do we live in a market that is shaped by regulated choice? I would say no, we don't at the moment. We actually live in a market that's been shaped by market forces. The question is how long that will continue.
So walk us through, Barnaby, what you know and your firm knows about how big the U.S. marketplace is.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me give you some headlines there. I'll talk first of all. Let's actually talk about the vapers themselves. We don't track underage vapers, so everything I say here is only applying to adults. There's about 16.5 million vapers in the US at the moment, and that's about 6%, roughly 1 in every 15, 16 adults. Of those, about 65%, 2/3, are vaping daily. So most of them are pretty regular users of their e-cigarettes. But it's worth knowing that only about 50% of them are exclusively vaping. The rest are dual using, which means they're vaping and they're also using some other form of nicotine. Now, typically that would be a combustible cigarette, but it might also be a pouch. It might even, conceivably be anything else from a pipe to a heat not burn system. But dual using is typically e-cigarette and combustibles. What are they using? About 40% of the market is disposables. About 40% is pods, and only about 20% now is open systems. So that rise in disposables, which has been seen in many major markets throughout the world. This is not something peculiar to the US at all. That rise in disposables, which you can see is really starting to take off at the beginning of this decade, is now a very dominant factor in the US market. Now, in terms of the market size in dollars, as you said, it's going to be about $12 billion next year, we forecast. And there's been pretty consistent growth. A little dip you see there around the time of the Valley crisis, but it was very, very quickly recovered from. It only really lasted that year. And so between 2019 and 24, you are going to see the market value almost double, not far off doubling, which is pretty impressive. And I think that's, another of the contradictions about the US, which again, we see in other countries sometimes. There are all these regulatory pressures. There is all this controversy. There is all this terrible PR. And yet people carry on vaping and they carry on buying e-cigarettes. One last thing I will say before handing back to you is that, in most countries, we wouldn't look at the grey market, the illegal market. The US is kind of an exception there because, as I say, technically almost everything is illegal. So, of course, those figures include that.
Yeah. How hard is it to actually track this marketplace when so many of the products are either fully illicit or in this gray market area because of the PMTA issue?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think oddly, in the case of the US, that doesn't make it particularly difficult because the law breaking, if you want to use that word, and I don't want to use it in an emotive way because, it's tolerated law breaking, is completely open. No, these are not, products being sold sort of in shady back streets where the regulators can't see them. They're being sold by mainstream retailers, and the regulators are saying, well, this is against the law, but actually we're not going to enforce it because we don't have, the resource to enforce it. So it's a really weird situation, a really weird one where, a lot of products they're de facto legal, but they're not actually legal. And so that, does create some uncertainty. That rug could be pulled out from underneath vapers and the industry at any point.
How was the data gathered to come up with these numbers?
Well, we use we have our own model for developing market sizes. We use a lot of different inputs there. So that might include other estimates. It might include retailer information. But we also work up from the numbers we have on actual vapers and individual use. So, for example, if you have a certain number of million vapers, a certain percentage of them are using disposables, the average price of a disposable, how many disposables somebody consumes in a week, then you can build up a value for the disposable market that kind of way. So a lot of it comes from the bottom up in that sense.
What about from the retailers? Do you get data directly from them?
We don't take data from retailers on that kind of systemic kind of feed basis. We're not receiving information from major supermarkets every week. But yeah, sure, we incorporate retail data into our projections.
So 16.5 million vapers in the US. Is that a large number? It seems large to me.
Yes, it is. I think, it is the world's largest vapor market by some distance. And so, of course, continues to be a very influential one. But, I think it's the percentage that's interesting. 6% of adults, it's 1 in 15 people. That's a lot. It's okay. It's still a minority. But if you look at it, if you look particularly at the world where smoking rates are going down as well, vape is no longer this very obscure kind of niche alternative to smoking. It's as mainstream as smoking, really. And okay, they're coming from different directions. Vape is becoming more mainstream while smoke becomes more marginalized. But it's definitely a serious thing now. Now, I think, you probably have a more pessimistic view of the US market than I do. I think that provides some grounds for optimism. I think, it's easy to take away something that a couple of 100,000 people use. It's harder to take away something that 16.5 million people use completely. That doesn't mean it won't be regulated in more restrictive ways, but it's tough to just ban it overnight. Apart from anything else, 6% of adults is enough to swing an election in many jurisdictions.
So with 16.5 million vapers in the U.S., FDA has approved for the marketplace 23 products. None of them are flavored. They're all pretty much made by big tobacco companies. So has the FDA done enough to satisfy that market, or are those products not at all being purchased by the market?
I don't think the FDA has done enough, and I think as I say, if you look at what people are actually using, and particularly if you look at what people are using in terms of flavors, where really very few people use only tobacco flavor, which is the only kind of flavor the FDA is really generally sympathetic to. No, I don't think the FDA is approving the products that people use at all.
Let's take a look here, Barnaby, at another slide of data you provided us, which is principal flavors in the U.S., percentage of products available. Walk us through this.
Yeah, well, this is really interesting. And I mean, one thing to say here is just to explain how we classify these flavors, because of course, a lot of flavors are mixed. So you might get, say, a watermelon menthol flavor. So that's a mixture of a fruit flavor and a cooling flavor. So what we've done here is we've tried to identify what is the principal, the dominant flavor in each product. So that's how they're classified. So you see, for example, cooling is pretty low there. That doesn't mean there's not a menthol cooling presence in a lot of these other products, but it's not the main ingredient, and therefore we assume it's not the reason that people are buying it. And anyway, what really stands out here is the complete and utter dominance of fruit flavors. Fruit flavors have been growing long term, led by strawberry and watermelon. There's quite a lot of other popular ones as well. Most other categories have been shrinking, not dramatically, not terribly in many cases, but they're losing ground while fruit is gaining. I think it's worth noting this also gives the lie to the concept that most vapes are candy flavored, or which they're not. That's just not true. Now, whether the youth of America seized by uncontrollable cravings for strawberry and watermelon, I don't know.
Yeah, it does give to the lie that tobacco control pushes incessantly that it's candy flavors and so forth. They started mentioning fruit, but it's just fruit flavors. How could you say only kids like watermelon? That's ridiculous.
Well, yeah, it's clearly patently untrue. And for that matter, it's clearly patently untrue that only kids like candy. Adults eat candy too. I think it is true. One can't deny there are some products that clearly are intended for kids, and it's often the packaging rather than the flavors that gives that away. But it's a small minority of products. And unfortunately, the industry as a whole has been somewhat tarred by the brush of those irresponsible manufacturers. Which is a real problem that the industry faces in a lot of countries, but particularly in the US. I think that's a place where it's worth making one of the other most important points about this market. Everything is about perception. It's not necessarily about reality. We can produce endless statistics showing that they're not candy flavors mostly, and the vapors aren't kids mostly, but people believe they are, and that's what matters.
Let's have a quick look here at the worldwide numbers, and some data you shared in the previous episode. The growth in worldwide vaping population in the millions, and our viewers can see here. You go back to 2016, there was 24 million vapers in the world. By 2024, that's 64. I mean, that's 40 million more people vaping worldwide. And when it comes to the growth of the worldwide vaping market, you can see here the USA is at 12.1 billion, which is nearly 5 times larger than the closest market, which is the UK at 2.2.
So yeah, as I say, the US is the world's biggest market. The UK is the second, but it's a really distant second. Of course, some of that is down to population. The US, it's a very large country in terms of population. China, has had some oddities in its adoption of e-cigarettes. India is very, very anti-e-cigs. Many other large countries like Brazil and so on have quite restrictive regimes of one sort or another, which again doesn't mean there aren't any vapors. But so the US has that combination of, it has a large population, it has an extremely well-developed retail infrastructure, etc., has a high degree of affluence, and it has a legal system, that is far from ideal in terms of e-cigarettes, but at least they're not banned. They were legal, they were allowed. Nobody strangled them at birth, as it were. Those factors I think come together in its adoption. I think probably also worth adding there, that has a population with a relatively high level of health awareness and education. So there is that incentive, for a lot of people to give up smoking.
So in terms of the retailers, you've got an interesting slide here. It's the impact of the PMTA process on vape stores. Walk our audience through this. What exactly does this mean?
Well, yeah, this is pretty striking, isn't it? Now, it's worth noting that this, is talking exclusively about, this particular slide is talking exclusively about vape stores, which are a minority channel for e-cigarettes. Only about 15% of American users actually use vape stores. The rest are either shopping online, about 20% of them, or they're using the more general retailers of one sort and another. But we do an annual vape store survey. We've been doing that since 2016, so we have quite a lot of historic data. And we go into a lot of detail in there about what's happening with the business of vape stores and what the perceptions of their owners and managers are. And it's a pretty bleak picture at the moment. Revenue has been dropping. People are pessimistic. There's competition. Of course, the disposables don't really suit the vape store model that well. That doesn't mean they can't sell them, but they're not ideal for a business model. That depends on higher value goods and a more complex sale and so on. So you're actually seeing a lot of vape stores diversify beyond e-cigarettes. A lot of selling products like CBD or kratom, for example. But on that slide, we asked specifically, how has the PMTA process, in other words, the FDA process of denying applications to sell e-cigarettes, because that's effectively what it is. How has it impacted you? And it's just overwhelmingly negative. The reddish pink there is the negatives. Hardly anybody says positive. Hardly anybody even says don't know. So certainly, at the vape store end of the market, the perception is that the FDA PMTA process, has been disastrous. I think we have to remember the vape store market is not the whole market by any stretch of the imagination. So that doesn't necessarily give a full picture, but it certainly, shows how hard it's hitting in that area.
Yeah, well, and as you mentioned, it is the romantic end of the vaping industry. It's certainly what we cover in that sense. The vape stores, really the health of the vape stores is really all that matters. Otherwise, it's just big box retailers or online people or big tobacco, right?
Well, yes, absolutely, yeah. But I think as well, I think this was always gonna happen as the industry grew and the industry became more mature. It was gonna progress from kind of niche artisanal sellers into big multinationals. The same way that coffee has become Starbucks and other huge chains like that. You get this kind of commoditization and corporatization. That's the price you pay in a sense for the size of the market. I don't think it's realistic to believe that a market of 16.5 million people and $12 billion would ever have been served by independent vape stores. Sad, but that's the way it is.
So the market is big and it's growing. Do you think it's unstoppable?
That's an interesting question. And I guess you mean unstoppable by regulation. Naturally, the market will top out at some point. Once virtually all smokers are converted to vape, there will always be a few nicotine naive users coming along, maybe even more. But no market is going to continue, a growth trajectory forever. It's never going to be 100% of adults vaping. That's simply unrealistic. So yes, the market will inevitably slow in the coming years. Now, what role will regulation play in that? My feeling is that in the US, regulation can slow the market. I don't think it'll kill the market. As I said, I think it's too big and too established now. And remember, it's established in law to an extent, and it's established even in this limited number of FDA PMTA approvals. But I think certainly the heavy hand of regulation could, restrict what could otherwise have been even greater market growth. I think that's absolutely true. We should also remember in this conversation, that it's not just the FDA we're dealing with here. There's also regulation at state level, sometimes at municipal level or county level. And often that can be, in some ways just as deleterious. The FDA, for all the fault we find it, at least there are, professionals there who understand the science and so on. That's not necessarily happening at a more local level. Regulation could be much more emotionally driven. So that's another thing that in certain areas of the country, certainly can press down. This kind of pressing down, often it affects the businesses in the sector, but the way it will affect consumers ultimately is through reduced choice. That doesn't necessarily mean everything being taken off the market. It may just mean, reduced product innovation or what have you.
Barnaby, let's turn back towards the illicit products, because obviously that affects the legal products or lack thereof. There's been a dedicated public relations campaign running that cast aspersions on the safety of vaping via attacks on illicit disposable vapes being dumped on the market by China. At least that's the story. I have a Fox News report from the state of Florida that really captures this kind of campaign. Let's have a listen.
Cracking down on illegal vapes, that's what state officials are trying to do.
New data shows the Florida market is being flooded with unregulated e-cigarettes. And our Kelly Cowan is live in the newsroom with a closer look at the problem and what state leaders are trying to do about all this. Hey, Kel.
Good morning to you. Yeah, this is a huge concern, not only because there is no way of actually knowing what is in these vapes that are being sold. According to the Florida Retail Federation, the majority of the vapes that are sold in our state right now, some 86%, are illegal and unregulated. unregulated. 3 Chinese-owned companies have dominated the market here in Florida, flooding stores with cheap disposable vapes that are wildly popular with teens and young people, and nearly all of their products have not seen any sort of review from the FDA or any other official agency to test for safety.
You're talking about something that has chemicals in it that are then going into your body, that the entire mechanism hasn't been reviewed in any way. There have been instances of fentanyl being associated with those products and other types of illicit substances.
The 3 companies that sell the most disposable vapes in Florida are Elf Bar, Fume, and HQD, all of which are Chinese-owned companies. The Florida Retail Federation says that manufacturers of illegal vapes exploit loopholes in U.S. regulations to create knockoffs that look so similar to the real thing that it's virtually impossible for consumers and store owners to know what's legit. Florida is hoping to crack down by requiring vape manufacturers to register with the state and certify that their products are compliant with both federal and state law. And according to a newly signed Florida law, if a vape manufacturer is found in violation of those requirements, they will be fined. The new law goes into effect on October 1st.
So I'm not too sure where to go with that. You first, Barnaby, what did you think?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I'll say first, I'm not quite sure what they're talking about when they talk about a loophole that allows manufacturers to produce knockoffs. So that's kind of weird. I don't think there is a loophole in the law as such. It's not to say people don't do that. But, I think the general tone of that kind of backs up very much what I was saying about the importance of perception. The report is a kind of smearing the vape industry and, by vague insinuation, it's Chinese owned, it's foreign companies coming in, targeting the young with, oh my God, there's chemicals, in these products. Heaven forbid that we should ever consume chemicals, and then throw in the mention of fentanyl because that sounds kind of frightening as well. And it reminds, and I'm not disputing that there are huge numbers of unregulated Chinese products on the market. That's clearly true. But the tone very much reminds me of the kind of coverage we saw around the time of the Uvalde crisis, where you did sense there was almost a kind of certain glee in some corners of the media in what appeared to be disastrous health impacts from e-cigarettes. Now, in time, it was discovered that actually those issues really had nothing to do with nicotine e-cigarettes at all. It was kind of coincidental, and it just looked that way for a brief period at first. But I think there's very much the same flavor, if you'll excuse the word, to this report here that you've just played.
Sure, and obviously in the U.S. there's quite a bit of alarmism out there around China. So, and we've been tracking this. We've done several stories on this over the last 18 months. As this program, this public relations campaign is wrapped up, and they just keep hitting the same number over and over and over again. And the fentanyl is the one that's extremely disturbing to hear that mixed in. And for mainstream media to run with it, I just think does such a disservice.
Well, I'd agree, yes. Because it gives people are going to come away with that, with the impression, the large numbers of vapes contain fentanyl, which is clearly not true. It may be literally true in a technical sense, that there are some vapes somewhere that contain fentanyl. I'm not disputing that. That probably is true. But that clearly isn't the case with the market as a whole, and yet that is the kind of implication you're getting here. And that's very similar to what we were talking about earlier about candy flavors and kid-friendly packaging. Yes, it exists, but don't fall into the trap of therefore assuming that is the entirety of the market. And that, unfortunately, is what is happening very often in the kind of public dialogue in the United States.
So the key thing in my mind about this program, besides just kind of smearing vapes and then alarmist around China and then the fentanyl and all that, is wrapping it up into the registry issue. And then, so that's the real place where I see the most danger for U.S. vaping going forward. The more states that come on with these registry bills and they get passed and signed into law, that creates a real problem because they're connected to the list that the FDA publishes of the products that they have approved for marketing, and that's just only those 23 products. So if in the case of, say, Florida, I mean, we're talking about almost all those products, even anything that would be considered a legal product would be removed from the shelves.
Yeah, I mean, as always, it all depends on enforcement. Simply creating a registry doesn't actually remove the products, but it certainly makes it more likely. I'd certainly agree with that. I talked, I think, at the beginning of this show about there being a kind of disconnect between the legal theory and the commercial reality in the United States. The registries, because they bring enforcement into a much more kind of, well, first a more local level, and frankly an easier to understand level. Somebody who doesn't necessarily know about anything about e-cigarettes is just given a list of products and sold, okay, these ones are legal. If they're not on that list, the retailers can't sell them. That makes it much easier to enforce, at a local street by street, store by store level. And so certainly, I think you're right. I think we could see the registry bills potentially being quite significant in the future of enforcement. There may well be disparities in how they're enforced from one state to another and what have you, or how tightly they're enforced. But they may well close some of that gap between the theory of only 20 odd products being legal and the reality of thousands and thousands of different products being sold.
We have this slide up that you provided on enforcement in vape stores. Could you?
We do. This is from a presentation we gave a little while ago, and I think it's if you look at the details, the story it tells. Now, bear in mind, this is about vape stores. It's not about general retail. If you look at the numbers in the bottom right, the activities of the enforcement agencies visiting, you can see that unsurprisingly, age was the really big one. But age is particularly important for states and county local authorities. They are almost, judging from this, their main concern when they visit vape stores on an enforcement visit is to check that there's no sales to minors. They're not really bothered as yet about product compliance. Only about 20% of their visits are dealing with that. The FDA in the left column has been proportionally less concerned with age, actually, and more concerned with product compliance, unsurprisingly, because it's the agency that is charged with approving or not approving products. The big question then is, I guess, will we see with these registers product compliance becoming more important, for at the local level and the state level? If it does, then yes, the registry can make a big difference. If it doesn't, and they really only remain concerned about underage vaping, then maybe not. I think that's open to see what happens. The registries exist. The registries now need to be enforced. So big question mark over what will happen there. I wouldn't necessarily, say it's the end of the world, but I equally wouldn't be very, optimistic and say it'll all be fine. It really could go either way. And as I say, it may well differ from one state to the next.
Yeah, and I think what's kind of devious about this is that these laws have provisions in there where wholesales and distributors and the people along the supply chain have to swear that the products are, a part of this FDA's 23 approved. And what it does is it really adds a layer of risk, I would say, to the supply chain.
It does, yes, certainly, and I mean, it creates it creates a regime that actually, at least potentially, can be enforced. Let's put it that way. The FDA on its own was never going to be able to enforce against every single retailer in the country. It's just unrealistic. It doesn't have the resources to do that, and it's not primarily an enforcement agency anyway. A state can probably quite easily enforce against the very limited number of e-cigarette distributors located in that state. That's not going to be a large number at all. So it suddenly does put enforcement on a more achievable level.
So let me ask you about this. In this whole idea of maybe an unholy alliance between tobacco control, the regulators, and say even big tobacco, we do know for sure that tobacco companies in the United States have spent a lot of money and time lobbying state governments to get these registry bills in place. It seems to me that there's a lot of actions that are going on in this space that can benefit both tobacco control and big tobacco at the same time at the expense of vaping.
Yes, possibly. And, I think that's right. They would be extremely strange bedfellows if they did. I think you hit the nail on the head there, when you say that big tobacco would benefit from the registries, basically because big tobacco have the products that are approved, or they are the ones who are in a position to get products approved. I've never subscribed in 10 years to the theory that big tobacco is out to kill vaping. And it makes less and less sense as time goes on to me that they're out to actually kill the category. But quite naturally, they would like it to be their products rather than the independent vape industry products that are sold, as any company would. And I think you could also say it's a bit of a win-win from big tobacco's point of view. Of course, if unhappy vapers go back to smoking, then big tobacco still wins. Or if they adopt big tobacco's legalized vapes, then big tobacco wins. So everything works in their favor commercially in terms of these registries.
Including, let me just say, including too as well, PMI and IQOS. There's a strange situation that's going on there.
There's an extremely strange situation with IQOS, which of course we believe, as is widely believed, is about to be launched in a fairly big way in the United States. Because it has not just a PMTA, the basic approval to be sold, but it actually has a modified risk tobacco product authorization that I believe PMI have recently reapplied for, which no e-cigarette has. In other words, the FDA is saying that you can advertise this product as being less risky, and even more, it has one of those modified risk statuses for a flavored product. So a flavored heated tobacco product has been officially endorsed by the FDA as being safer than cigarettes. Being safer than smoking, combustible conventional cigarettes. Yet no e-cigarette has, no flavored e-cigarettes has even been approved. Now, I wouldn't necessarily read any very arcane conspiracy into this. I sometimes wonder if the FDA, spent a lot of time kicking themselves for having granted that approval to IQOS, because it's actually so inconsistent with the policies they've since developed. But of course, having once granted it, they can't ungrant it. But it is distinctly weird. I would agree with that. Of course, from a broader point of view, it's good for IQOS. It's good for PMI. It's potentially good for opening up the heated tobacco category in general, which hasn't really existed in the United States at all to this point. Though it's quite big in some other countries. So that perhaps does provide another route for vapers who if they become dissatisfied by limited product choice in vaping. There is that positive there as well.
I've got a quote maybe to speak to that, Barnaby. It's a pretty famous quote from Upton Sinclair, who was a prolific American writer and social reformer. Here it is. "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." Is this not the case when it comes to tobacco control's response to vaping?
Possibly, though I would actually modify it a little bit. I think, at least in the United States, I think my reading is a little bit different. It's that the FDA probably does understand vape in principle, but it is structurally completely unable to act on that. So I would say, it is difficult to get a man to be flexible when his salary depends on not being flexible. That's the way I would put it. I don't think it's necessarily a lack of comprehension, but it's an inability to do anything about that comprehension. And it wouldn't surprise me, if there are around the world, a lot of regulators who find themselves, very anti-vape because that's what their institutions demand of them, when in their private lives, perhaps members of their family vape or whatever, and they're quite happy with it. That truly wouldn't surprise me. I think these are often institutional and structural issues. They're not, down to individuals trying to thwart the industry. But unfortunately, that doesn't make them any easier to solve. It probably makes them harder.
Barnaby, last question for you. Is there an eternal optimistic argument for a thriving U.S. vaping market?
I would call myself an eternal cautious optimist there. You know, I think it would be over negative and overreacting to say the writing is on the wall, you know, the sky is falling in and all that. I think it would equally be very foolish to say, you know, everything's fine, you know, these are just minor blips we're going to get over. I think, you know, a vaping market will continue. The sector, the category is not going to disappear. The question is how far factors such as FDA regulation and also, you know, external factors that are not directly connected with vape, such as, you know, the obvious prospect of a, you know, serious trade war with China, how far those things affect the market. Some of those are unknown. I'd leave people with the thought, you know, the other big unknown is what's going to happen in November, and then, you know, what's going to happen with the US government in general after that. You know, what resources will the FDA have? What will it be told its priorities are, you know, under a new administration, who's ever it is? We clearly don't know, but we'll know soon.